The box wobbled, and Matt leaped with fear. He stumbled backward and landed hard on the ground, his heart beating hard. Scanning the yard, he searched for any sign that this might be a prank by his neighbor, but the only thing he could see were the butterflies flying by. Bravely, he moved closer to the box and bent to peep. The box wobbled again, and suddenly, something popped out, a little paw. Matt had just moved into his new home, a cozy duplex on the outskirts of town. He loved the little garden in his yard, but he wanted to replace the flowers with vegetables. Vegetables were more practical plants, and he often wondered why people wasted garden space planting flowers. So he had gotten his garden tools and began digging. He was going to take out the flowers and trash them, but he had barely begun digging when his shovel struck something. A box. Matt had just dug up the box and unwrapped it when it began to wobble. To his surprise, he found a tiny, malnourished puppy, just a few months old, whimpering in the box. The puppy's eyes were tiny and red, and its fur was thick with dirt. Matt looked around him, wondering who had been unkind enough to bury this little puppy and leave it for dead. Why would you think anyone would do that? Matt's heart melted as he gently picked the puppy up and cradled it in his arms. It was then he noticed something else. Matt noticed wilted flowers scattered inside the carton. Once they were vibrant daisies and roses, but now they looked frail, like a frail creature. Matt frowned. What were the flowers for? Why would anyone bury a puppy alive, and why would they bury it with flowers? What do you think happened? Matt soon found out. His wandering fingers slipped into the carton again, and this time it touched a thin leather collar that was dulled with age. Matt drew it out carefully, and his thumb brushed over the nameplate. Buddy? The word was simple, yet intimate. Below the name was a phone number, but the iron was too rusted to make it out. His fingers made one final foray into the carton, and this time it only found a folded piece of paper. He pulled it free and opened it. Then he read the scrawled words quickly. As he read, his body relaxed with understanding. Buddy, born March 14th, 2024. Died August 20th, 2024. Forever in my heart. Someone had thought this puppy dead, and they had cared enough to mourn him. They had cared enough to give him what they thought was a proper farewell. And yet, they had been so tragically wrong. A soft whimper snapped Matt out of his thoughts. He watched the puppy's frail body shudder, and he felt something zap through him. Matt picked it up quickly, but very gently. There was a faint bruise on its side, which meant it was injured. It might have been from a fall, a blow, or maybe something worse. Whatever had happened, it must have left the puppy unconscious. Can you imagine the owner's heartbreak as they buried him without realizing their mistake? The puppy's fur was damp and matted with dirt, and its small body was too warm. He couldn't understand how the fragile creature was still alive, except that it had fought to live. You've made it this far, Matt whispered, his voice cracking. You did it. You're alive. Obviously, Buddy wasn't ready to be a memory, and Matt wasn't going to allow it to become one too. What do you think Matt would do now? Matt placed the puppy gently into a towel-lined basket and ran to his car. He opened the passenger door and gently placed Buddy on the seat. Then he adjusted the towel as though the puppy's comfort might keep him alive longer. He closed the door and ran over to the driver's side. He slid behind the wheel, gripped the steering wheel, and pushed to start. As he drove, he tried to keep his focus on the road despite the barrage of thoughts in his head. He had only been in this town a few weeks, but thankfully, the small-town vet clinic sign caught his eye when he went shopping for supplies. As he neared the building, he couldn't help but wonder, what if they couldn't save it? Not today, he murmured under his breath. The weight behind those words was heavy, but very familiar. Not this time, he repeated, and stepped on the accelerator. But what had happened to him last time? Was Matt remembering something from his past? Matt burst into the vet's minutes later. A few heads turned to him as he strode to the counter with the puppy wrapped in a towel and clutched to his chest. I need a vet, he said urgently. Now! The receptionist blinked. She looked startled, and he was about to apologize when she dived for the phone. She spoke quickly, but she barely replaced the receiver when a vet appeared, walking quickly in stilettos. She was a petite woman in scrubs and with sharp eyes. "Follow me," she told Matt. Matt did not need any further invitations. He followed her through the corridors until they walked into a room with a steel exam table. He placed the puppy down on the table carefully, and the vet got to work. She used her fingers to examine the battered body. "He's malnourished and dehydrated," she frowned as she pressed lightly on its side. "There's bruising here, possibly a fall, or worse. I'll need x-rays and blood work to get a clearer picture." "I'll cover it," Matt said immediately. The vet looked up at him. "This is not your dog." Matt shook his head. "But does that matter?" "Of course not. It's just these kinds of treatments can be really expensive," she said gently. "It doesn't matter," Matt whispered. Her eyes softened. "We'll start right away then. You can wait here." She turned and wheeled the table out of the room. Alone again, Matt sank into the waiting room chair, his gaze fixed on the tiled floor. He felt déjà vu, and he knew why. He had been here before. He had experienced this before, but in a different hospital, and the frail creature was definitely not a puppy. And in that other hospital, the doctor had returned with sad eyes. Who do you think died in Matt's past? Like and subscribe and find out more. Matt shook himself and jumped up. He rushed out of the room and began searching around for the lab. This time, he must be present to say goodbye. Will he be too late? Matt never got to say goodbye, because when he burst through those doors, Buddy was still breathing, and he didn't stop breathing until the X-ray and other tests were over. And he didn't stop breathing on the ride home either. It survived, but the worst was yet to pass. The first few days were a blur of sleepless nights for Matt. The vet warned that its recovery would be slow. The internal injuries had been repaired, but the puppy was still too frail. Matt was determined to revive it. He set up a corner of the living room with blankets, a heating pad, and a shallow bowl of water, and he rarely left Buddy's side. The puppy would whimper faintly in his sleep, his tiny body twitching as if fighting against all odds, and Matt would place a hand over its small frame, petting it. "You're tougher than you look," he murmured one night. "You'll get through this." Taking care of Buddy brought a routine to his days, which he hadn't realized he needed. What do you think he did to help it? Matt woke early every day to prepare the puppy's special meals, mixing the vet-recommended kibble with boiled chicken and rice. He kept a detailed schedule of its medication times, too. He would even crush the pills and mix them in the food. But Buddy's appetite was small, so feeding it was literally an operation. He would try to spoon-feed it, but if it refused to eat, he would wet his finger with the broth and let the puppy lick it. Water was another challenge. Buddy's weakness made it hard for him to drink on his own, so Matt used a small syringe to drip water into his mouth. It was tedious, but Matt didn't mind. Also, every afternoon, he would gently carry it outside to the yard in his arms and let it sniff the fresh air and feel the sunlight on its fur. On one of those afternoons outside, Buddy even tried to stand on his own for the first time. His legs wobbled and he stumbled almost immediately, but the effort made Matt smile. "That's it, Buddy," he exclaimed. "How long do you think it took Buddy to get better?" Buddy's progress was slow, but by the end of the first week, it could lift its head and drink from the small bowl Matt refilled religiously. By the second week, he had even managed to take wobbly steps across the living room rug. As the puppy grew stronger, Matt found himself smiling more often. It was subtle at first, a quirk on the lips when Buddy barked or stumbled over his oversized paws, but the moments became more frequent. One morning, as the puppy bounded toward him with his tail wagging furiously, Matt couldn't help but laugh. It was a deep, uninhibited sound, but it was one he hadn't heard from himself in years. Even Buddy seemed surprised. It stopped mid-step, its head tilting curiously, and then it launched itself into Matt's arms. "You're something else, you know that?" Matt scratched Buddy's ears, and it had yipped in response, his bright eyes meeting Matt's. Bathing Buddy was another milestone. Matt had waited until Buddy was stronger because he didn't want to hurt it, so its fur was still matted with dirt and dried blood. Matt spent over an hour gently washing him in the sink. The puppy shivered at first, but as Matt worked, Buddy began to relax. By the time the towel came out, its eyes were half closed in contentment. Matt and Buddy soon became so close, and every night, when the puppy curled up at the foot of the couch, Matt would find himself talking to it. He would tell the puppy about his day, the books he was reading, and the vegetables he planned to grow in the garden. One night, Matt realized something. Buddy wasn't just healing, he was helping Matt heal too. What do you think Matt needed to heal from? Matt had grieved for 2 years. The mornings were the hardest. He would wake early before the alarm rang, and for a moment, he would forget. Then he would stretch his hand to the person who had slept beside him for 3 years and touch nothing. The realization was usually like a punch to the gut. He would sit up, rub his eyes, and the ache would pierce him again. It had been 2 years since Emma died. 2 years of going through the motions but never quite living. The grief had settled deep into him. It had even become a part of him. There were good days, days where he could almost believe he was okay, but those days were rare, and the emptiness was always waiting, hovering around and ready to crash back into him when he least expected it. But now, with Buddy, it felt different. Well, for the first time, he hadn't thought about anything else. His mind had been consumed by the need to save this little life. And there were moments, like when Buddy curled up beside him on the couch, that Matt realized he hadn't felt this kind of peace in forever. The house was still empty, but it wasn't quite as silent anymore. The soft padding of Buddy's paws on the floor filled the space, and the occasional bark and the excited yips when it was time to eat or go outside all reminded Matt that there were other joys in life. And each time Buddy looked at him with those bright eyes, as if Matt were the only person who mattered, a part of him that had been dormant for so long began to stir. But Buddy soon did something else. What was that? It began with walks and short trips around the neighborhood so Buddy could stretch his legs. The puppy loved being outside. It always jumped about, its nose sniffing the air and its tail wagging with clear joy. And Matt always followed behind like a proud father. There was something infectious about the puppy's joy, and in how it could find wonder in something as small as a fallen leaf, or the rustling of a bush, or a flying butterfly. Soon, the walks became a ritual. Every evening, they would walk a little farther and explore. Matt began to notice things he hadn't before. The way the sunlight cast patterns on the ground, new bird tweets he hadn't heard before, the scent of freshly cut grass, and even blooming flowers. One afternoon, as they walked past a small park, Buddy saw something that made him halt in his tracks. He tugged at Matt's leash and dragged it toward a patch of wildflowers near the edge of a pond. The colors looked so vibrant. There were yellows, purples, and reds dancing in the breeze. That evening, he found himself in his garden, staring at the empty flower beds he had once planned to fill with vegetables. And he felt a spark of inspiration. The very next morning, he drove to the local nursery and spent hours wandering the aisles, picking out packets of seeds and trays of young plants. He picked out daisies, tulips, lavender, and anything that caught his eye. He even got a few gardening books. When he returned, he got to work immediately. Soon he was working the whole garden, and Buddy was never far from his side. It dug little holes in the dirt or chased after stray leaves while he worked. The garden began to transform. There were bursts of color springing to life where there was once only soil. And as the flowers bloomed, so did Matt. He began to crave the outdoors more than he ever had in 2 years. He even explored new parks and drove out to the countryside with Buddy. One day, he and Buddy even discovered a small creek tucked away in a forest. When they reached the creek, Buddy leaped immediately and landed in the water with a splash. But Matt didn't. He watched the dog swim about in stunned silence. He wanted that. He wanted that inhibited joy. For a moment, Emma flashed through his mind. He used to urge her to step outside her comfort zone, and suddenly he felt a pang of longing, not just for her, but for the version of himself he had lost. Before he could overthink it, he slipped off his shoes, rolled up his jeans, and jumped into the creek too. The icy water shocked him and sent a shiver down his spine, but he felt so alive. Soon they were splashing water on each other, and Matt was laughing, real, deep belly laughter that echoed through the trees. It wasn't just the kind of laughter that escaped your lips, it was the kind that eased your soul. After that day, their adventures grew bolder. Matt started planning outings to new places, hiking trails, hidden lakes, and even the beach. Buddy became his co-pilot, sitting proudly in the passenger seat, head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. They climbed hills together where Buddy would bound ahead, only to wait for Matt to catch up. They discovered fields of wildflowers where Buddy would run in circles. At the beach, Buddy chased seagulls on the shore, and his tiny paws left imprints in the wet sand. Even with Emma, Matt had always thought adventures required grand plans. But Buddy had taught him otherwise. The real adventure, he realized, was in rediscovering the simple joys of life. The wind in his hair, the sun on his face. For the first time in years, Matt felt alive. But that was about to end. It all began when they decided to visit a new park. The park was beautiful. Children chased each other across the grass, and parents yelled after them. Matt walked along the path, and Buddy trotted happily beside him. It had grown into a vibrant ball of energy, and its coat was now sleek and shiny. It had even grown taller. A group of joggers waved at them as they passed. One even stopped to pet Buddy. But as they reached a clearing near the fountain, Buddy suddenly stopped, his ears perking up. Matt glanced down at him, surprised, but before he could react, Buddy pulled him toward a bench shaded by an old oak tree. Sitting on the bench was a woman. She had a book in her lap, but her gaze was fixed on Buddy. She looked shocked, and her lips were slightly parted, like she couldn't quite believe her eyes. Matt tightened his grip on the leash, confused. He hadn't seen anyone look at Buddy like that before, not with familiarity. The woman stood up slowly, her eyes darting between Buddy and Matt. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Is something wrong?" he asked. She stepped closer. "That collar?" Her voice trembled. "Where did you get it?" Matt glanced at Buddy, the familiar blue collar snug around his neck. "It was with him when I found him," he said carefully. "Why?" The woman's eyes filled with tears and her hand trembled as she pointed at Buddy. That's my puppy," she said, her voice breaking. "His name is Buddy." Matt felt the ground shift beneath him. He looked down at Buddy. The puppy was wagging his tail furiously. It clearly recognized the woman. Matt's chest tightened as he connected the dots. The collar, the chain, the box. "I thought he was gone," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "I even buried him. I thought I had lost him forever." Matt's throat tightened as Buddy leaped into her arms. The joy on her face was clear, but for Matt, there was nothing joyful about the moment. He stood there, silent, watching as the dog he had grown to love so deeply nuzzled into the arms of his rightful owner. She glanced up at Matt with bright eyes. "You saved him." Matt managed a tight smile. "I just found him," he said. "Buried in a box in my yard. He was lucky, I guess." She rose to her feet, still holding Buddy's collar. "Lucky doesn't even begin to describe it. You don't know how much this means to me." Her gaze softened as she looked down at the little dog that was now wagging its tail so hard its entire body was swaying. Matt nodded. He should have known this moment might come, should have expected it, really. Buddy wasn't his dog. He had simply been the one to patch him up. "I guess you want him back," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. She hesitated. "He's my dog," she said softly, as if the words were meant to reassure her rather than him. "I thought I had lost him and—" She trailed off, blinking rapidly. Matt forced himself to smile. "Of course, he's yours." The woman looked up, her expression caught between joy and guilt. "I'm so grateful, really. I can't even imagine what you went through to save him." "It wasn't much," he lied. "I don't live far from here. Maybe you could bring him by tomorrow? I would like to thank you properly, and it'll give me time to get things ready for him at home." He nodded. "Sure, tomorrow." "I'm Beth," she said. "Matt." He nodded. Buddy trotted back to him then, its tail still wagging happily. It was quite oblivious to the storm brewing in Matt's chest. Matt didn't want to explore anymore, so they went straight home. The next afternoon, Matt drove Buddy to her house. The drive felt longer than it should have, and the world outside the window looked blurry in the late afternoon light. They finally pulled up in front of her house, but Matt didn't want to get down. He peered at the house and sighed. It was so modest, but charming. It had a pale yellow siding and a white picket fence. The porch looked cozy too, with hanging plants dancing gently in the breeze. It took several minutes, but at least he forced himself out of the car. He opened the side door for Buddy, and it jumped out happily. At the gate, Matt hesitated before taking a deep breath and pushing it open. He could hear the faint sound of classical music as they walked towards the front door. They climbed the porch, but before he could knock, the door opened, and there she was. "You're here?" she exclaimed. "I brought him, as promised," Matt said simply. She was in a casual dress, something simple but pretty, and the faint scent of something delicious wafted from the kitchen. Buddy jumped on her and she giggled. She knelt to hug him tighter, and it licked her face. She stood up while holding Buddy against her chest. "Come on in. I made lunch." Matt hesitated in surprise. "I don't want to intrude." "Oh, I insist. It's the least I can do." She stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Please, I've made too much food to eat alone." Matt stood for a moment unsure, then he sighed quietly. "Okay," he said, "but just for a bit." The house smelled like roasted chicken, and the warmth of the rooms with the delicate touches in the decor made it feel inviting. It also looked very homey. "Make yourself comfortable," she said while leading him into the dining room, where the table was already set for two with plates, napkins, and silverware in place. It was simple but beautifully arranged, and there was something about it that made Matt feel very comfortable. Buddy jumped up on one of the chairs and the pretty lady laughed. "I see he's still spoiled." Matt smiled. He sat across from her at the dining table, trying to push down the mix of emotions that plagued him. The table and the soft flicker from the candlelight felt far too intimate. It didn't match the sorrowful emotions within him. "I made roasted chicken," she said, breaking the silence as she lifted the covers. "It's my favorite comfort food." Her voice was light, but Matt could hear the faint nervousness, as though she too was unsure of how to navigate the conversation. "Comfort food is always good," he offered a small smile as she served him. The food tasted as good as it smelled, and he let himself relax. Beth lifted her fork to her mouth, and for a moment, Matt couldn't look away. He noticed how her eyes crinkled at the edges when she smiled, and how her soft features made her look warm. She was beautiful in a way that made him feel uncomfortable. Matt chose that moment to rest its head on his knee, and Matt reached down to stroke its head. "What happened to him?" he asked suddenly. "An accident," she whispered, as if Buddy could understand them. "Hit by a car, lost consciousness on the spot." "How terrible." "It was all my fault." She looked really sad. "I let go of the leash for 1 second, and he—" Matt grabbed her hand without thinking, and they both froze. He let go. "It is not your fault," he said quickly. "I mean, Buddy really likes you, so you must have been such a doting owner." The smile crept on her lips and brightened her face, but she didn't say a word. "And you're a pretty good cook, too," he continued. "Do you always whip up full meals for strangers, or only for dog rescuers?" She laughed this time. "Oh, don't let it get to your head. You're special only because of Buddy, though I might reconsider if you do the dishes." Matt did not see the jab coming. "Ah, so this was also a trap," he smirked. "Feed me a great meal and then rope me into kitchen duty. I see how it is." She grinned. "Well, if you can save a dog, you can wash some plates. You seem like the type." "And what type is that exactly? Rugged but domestic? Or just a guy who can't say no to a pretty smile?" He blurted out before he could think. Her cheeks turned pink at the compliment, but she didn't look away. Instead, she tilted her head. "You tell me, Matt, which one are you?" He hesitated. "Depends. Sometimes both." She grinned. "You're definitely cocky. I am too. That's why Buddy did most of the heavy lifting in our relationship. You know, I'm not sure that'll be the case anymore. He is used to a pretty balanced and sane relationship." Her eyebrow arched. "Oh, really? Are you trying to say he loves you more now? Because judging by how easy this transition is for him, I'm pretty sure that's not true." "I'm just saying," Matt shrugged with a smile. "Give him a few days to realize what he's missing." Her smile faltered for a second. "You'll miss him." It wasn't a question this time, and the smile left his lips. "Well," he hesitated, "of course I will." He sighed. She smiled suddenly. "You know, you're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He frowned. "I don't know," she shrugged, "but not someone who would be this easy to talk to." Her words hung between them. "Am I what you expected?" She broke the silence. "Precisely," Matt nodded. "Oh, and what did you expect?" He hesitated again. "Someone who would be easy to like." Her smile deepened, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The days after their lunch blurred by. What began as a few polite texts to check on Buddy turned into longer conversations. Each time Matt's phone buzzed, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. One evening, she texted him an invitation. "There's a food truck festival at the park tomorrow. You in?" He stared at the message longer than he would like to admit, and the corner of his mouth curled into a smile. Finally, he joked in reply, "Depends. Are you paying?" Her response came quickly. "Only if you bring Buddy's favorite treats. Priorities, Matt." And he laughed. The next evening, they met and wandered the park together, with Buddy trotting ahead, sniffing discarded napkins and wagging his tail at passers-by. "You know," she said, "I didn't peg you as the food truck type." Matt raised an eyebrow. "And what type did you peg me as?" "Grill master in the backyard, beer in hand, classic dad energy." "Wow, stereotypical much?" "For your information, I'm open to all culinary experiences, especially when churros are involved." She smirked. "Noted. I'll make sure to file that under Matt Facts." As the evening wore on, they spoke about things they had never. Beth talked about her career as a freelance photographer, the places she had traveled, and her dreams of opening her own gallery. Matt loved the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about her dreams. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I've been rambling. What about you? What did you dream of doing before?" Her voice trailed off, and Matt knew she was trying to avoid treading into painful territory. "Before life got messy," he finished for her. She nodded. Matt smiled. And then he began talking. He told her how he was taking up architecture again, and even dabbling into woodwork. As he spoke, he felt something that felt like hope. They stayed until the sky turned deep purple and the stars began to emerge. Then they walked back to their cars. Their hands brushed once, then twice. On the third time, he didn't pull away. And it felt good. Sometimes life doesn't give you second chances, but when it does, do you embrace it or let it pass you by? And before you go, don't forget to like and subscribe if this video made you think, smile, or cry.